In November 2014, a 90-year-old man stood in a public park in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, holding a plate of hot food. He had cooked it himself that morning, the same way he had every Wednesday for 23 years. He handed it to a homeless man sitting on a bench. Then a police officer walked up and said, "Drop that plate right now," as if the old man were holding a weapon. Arnold Abbott, a World War II veteran, had just been arrested for feeding the hungry. What happened next would spark a battle still being fought across America today. 35 years before that arrest, Arnold and his wife Maureen were loading plates of home-cooked food into their car and driving to Fort Lauderdale Beach. Nobody stopped them. Nobody said a word. It was 1979. And feeding people who had nothing seemed like the most obvious thing in the world. When Maureen passed away in 1991, Arnold founded a nonprofit in her memory called Love Thy Neighbor Fund. He was 67 years old. He could have grieved quietly. Instead, he turned his loss into a mission. Every Wednesday at 5:30 in the evening, Arnold and his volunteers would set up on the beach and serve home-cooked meals to anyone who showed up. Hundreds came every week. Between his organization and half a dozen church groups and smaller nonprofits operating across Fort Lauderdale, volunteers were collectively feeding more than 500 homeless people a day. For many of them, it was the only hot food they would eat all week. But Arnold did not just hand out plates. He built a culinary training school through his nonprofit that graduated over 400 for formerly homeless men and women with food safety certifications and chef's certificates. His motto was simple: give a hand up, not a handout. The city of Fort Lauderdale was not impressed. In 1999, they banned him from feeding people on the beach. Arnold sued the city and won. For 15 years after that, he kept right on cooking and serving without interference. Then in October of 2014, Fort Lauderdale passed a brand new ordinance. Feeding sites had to be at least 500 feet apart and 500 feet from any residential property. Only one feeding site per city block. Organizations had to provide portable toilets. The city called it a regulation. Arnold called it exactly what it was: a way to push homeless people out of sight. On November 2nd, he showed up with 300 prepared meals. He had served exactly 4 plates when the officers arrived. They told him to stop. He kept serving. They cited him. He came back the next Wednesday, cited again. The Wednesday after that, cited a third time. 3 citations in less than 2 weeks, each one carrying a possible 60-day jail sentence and a $500 fine. When reporters asked if he was afraid, Arnold said he was not looking to go to jail, but if he had to, he would. He told the Sun-Sentinel newspaper that he would continue as long as there was breath in his body. The story went national overnight. A 90-year-old World War II veteran arrested for giving food to hungry people. The mayor of Fort Lauderdale, Jack Seiler, tried to defend the ordinance. He said he was not satisfied with having a cycle of homelessness in his city. He suggested Arnold could feed people at a church instead, or a block over, somewhere indoors and out of view. But advocates set up feeding stations right outside City Hall in protest. Civil disobedience spread across the city, and in December of 2014, a Florida Circuit Court judge temporarily halted the law. Arnold Abbott kept feeding people on that beach every Wednesday until he passed away in 2019 at the age of 94. He never stopped. But the fight he started did not end with him. If anything, it got worse. By 2014, the National Coalition for the Homeless reported that more than 70 American cities had enacted some form of food-sharing restriction. Houston, Philadelphia, Las Vegas, Atlanta, and dozens more. Some required expensive permits, others demanded portable toilets at feeding sites. A few banned outdoor food distribution entirely. And the people getting caught up in these laws were not restaurant owners or food truck operators. They were church groups and retired couples, teenagers volunteering on weekends, ordinary Americans doing what their conscience told them to do. In November of 2018, something happened in Kansas City, Missouri, that shocked even the people who had been following these stories for years. A volunteer group called Free Hot Soup had been organizing potluck-style food giveaways in city parks. They cooked chili and sandwiches and soup in their own kitchens and brought it to people who had nothing. They had been doing it without incident for a long time. Then the Kansas City Health Department got involved. Officials had been monitoring the group's social media pages to figure out where they would be setting up. On November 4th, health inspectors showed up at 4 separate park locations across the city. They confiscated every bit of food, home-cooked chili, stacks of foil-wrapped sandwiches, vats of hot soup, and then they poured bleach on it. Not metaphorically, they literally dumped the food into plastic bags and soaked it in bleach to make absolutely certain nobody could go back and recover it. People who had been standing in line waiting for a hot meal watched city workers destroy their dinner right in front of them. The health department's director, Rex Archer, defended the action by citing food safety concerns. He said the food was prepared in private homes, not approved kitchens. He warned about E. coli and Salmonella and Listeria. He said homeless people are especially vulnerable to foodborne illness because they lack access to medical care and bathrooms. The irony was breathtaking. The city was so worried about protecting homeless people from theoretical food poisoning that they poured actual poison on their food, and the alternative they offered was nothing at all. When video of the bleaching circulated on social media, the backlash was enormous. The Kansas City Police Union president publicly criticized the health department. Volunteers came back the very next weekend with even more food. The health department eventually announced it would stop using bleach going forward, but the damage was done, and Kansas City was far from the only city cracking down. In Houston, a group called Food Not Bombs had been serving meals downtown 4 days a week for 20 years. Then in the spring of 2023, police began issuing citations for violating the city's charitable feeding ordinance. The city's attorney released a statement saying Houston intended to vigorously pursue violations. A lawyer representing one of the cited volunteers called the enforcement absurd and said the city was criminalizing the Samaritan for giving. But it was what happened in El Cajon, California, that showed just how far this had gone. In 2018, 12 volunteers were charged with misdemeanors for distributing food to homeless people. One of those volunteers was a 14-year-old boy who had been passing out plates when an officer told him to step aside. 14 years old, charged with a misdemeanor for handing someone a meal. In Tampa, 7 more volunteers were arrested in January of 2017. In Raleigh, a one-day permit to serve food in a city park cost $800. And in Fort Lauderdale, even after Arnold Abbott's legal battles, the city kept passing new ordinances, 4 separate anti-homeless laws in a single year. Across the country, the justification sounded the same: food safety, public health, sanitation, the need to connect homeless people with established shelters instead of informal feeding events. But advocates pushed back hard on that logic. The National Coalition for the Homeless pointed out that there were no documented cases of food poisoning from public food sharing events, not a single one. The whole argument was theoretical, and the idea that you could reduce homelessness by taking away someone's dinner was, to put it plainly, ridiculous. When the Kansas City Health Department director cited the Haiti cholera epidemic as a comparison to justify his crackdown on volunteer soup kitchens in American parks, critics pointed out that Kansas City is not post-earthquake Haiti. And this raises a question that kept coming up across every single one of these stories. What actually happens to the people these volunteers were trying to reach when nobody is allowed to show up? A homeless person sleeping under a highway overpass in late November, temperatures below freezing, cotton blankets that soak up moisture and actually pull heat away from the body. Hypothermia can set in within hours, and emergency shelters across the country regularly turn people away because they are full. One thing I've started keeping in my car after covering stories like this is an emergency thermal bag called TerraShell. It uses a reflective lining that bounces about 90% of your body heat back to you, the same technology search and rescue teams carry. It folds down to about the size of a soda can. I keep one in my glove box and a few at home, not just for myself, but because if you see someone who needs help, handing them something that could actually keep them warm is something you can do right now. No permit required. I left a link in the description if you want to take a look. If this video is helpful, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week. Now, one organization refused to back down no matter how many times they got arrested. Food Not Bombs is an international movement that started in the 1980s. They share free vegetarian meals as a form of political expression, arguing that money spent on military and war could end hunger and poverty instead. The group has been at the center of legal battles in Tampa, Orlando, Fort Lauderdale, Atlanta, Houston, and dozens of other cities. Their legal argument rests on the First Amendment. They say feeding the hungry is expressive conduct. It is protected speech. And for years, courts went back and forth on whether that argument held up. In August of 2018, a federal court in Fort Lauderdale ruled that Food Not Bombs' weekly food sharing events were constitutionally protected, expressive conduct under the First Amendment. The judge wrote that by organizing those events, the group was making a political point. That ruling was a breakthrough, but it only applied to one jurisdiction. Cities across the country continued enforcing their own bans. Then in May of 2026, the fight arrived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Tulsa chapter of Food Not Bombs had been handing out hot meals on a weekly basis since 2020. 6 years without a single complaint, a single health issue, or a single incident. On the evening of May 6th, police officers showed up and told volunteers they needed a special permit to be out on the street. When the volunteers continued packing food into containers and handing out meals, officers demanded their identification and called for backup. Body camera footage from that night tells the story. A woman named Savannah Davis tried to leave carrying a plastic bin of supplies she had just finished cleaning up to comply with the officer's orders. An officer grabbed her arm and told her to stop or she would go to jail. Davis pulled away and said it was her First Amendment right. The officer responded by placing her under arrest. Another volunteer was arrested for stepping in. In total, 4 people were handcuffed and taken into custody. 6 more were cited, all for handing out hot food. The city of Tulsa later said they had engaged with the group at least 20 times over the previous year about permitting requirements. Food Not Bombs maintained they had a constitutional right to feed people without government permission. But the most dramatic chapter in this entire story played out in Dayton, Ohio. A woman named Michaela Moran started a nonprofit called Nourish Our Neighbors in 2022. The organization had 3 employees and about 35 regular volunteers. They spent their time on the ground in Dayton's homeless community, meeting people where they lived, providing food and clothing and hygiene supplies. Dayton had an ordinance that made it a crime to distribute food in central areas of the city without a permit. The permit cost $50 per event, plus a $250 security deposit for organizations with prior violations. For a small nonprofit running entirely on donations, every dollar going toward permits was money that could not be spent feeding people. In April of 2024, Michaela and her volunteers showed up to distribute 200 breakfast burritos they had woken up at 5 in the morning to prepare. Police arrived and ordered them to shut down. when one volunteer handed a burrito to a homeless man. The officer handcuffed him and detained him for more than 30 minutes. The arresting officer said the volunteer would be spending at least one night in jail and would be fined $500. He was eventually released without charges, but the damage was clear. 170 perfectly good breakfast burritos were thrown in the trash that day, and hungry people did not get fed. The absurdity of the ordinance was hard to ignore. As advocates pointed out, someone could legally hand out cake and ice cream for a birthday party in the exact same location without a permit. But a nonprofit feeding homeless people had to pay fees and jump through bureaucratic hoops just to share a burrito. Michaela fought back. She connected with the Pacific Legal Foundation, a national nonprofit law firm that took her case free of charge. And on June 23, 2026, just days ago, a federal court in Ohio struck down Dayton's food sharing ban entirely. The United States District Court for the Southern District of Ohio ruled that Nourish Our Neighbors charitable work is protected expression under the First Amendment. The judge found the ordinance unconstitutionally vague. City officials could not even clearly explain where the law applied. A Dayton police commander, when pressed to define the line between legal and illegal food distribution, admitted that it would depend on how many tacos were being given out. The court barred Dayton from enforcing its food sharing permit requirement. Michaela Moran announced that her group's next distribution event would take place on July 5th at Levitt Pavilion in downtown Dayton. The lead attorney on the case said it came down to a simple injustice. People wanted to make their community better, and the government said, "Not without my permission." Arnold Abbott's story started this fight more than 2 decades ago. A 90-year-old man with a plate of food and a refusal to quit. He passed away before he could see this ruling, but his legacy runs through every volunteer who kept showing up after being told to stop. Through Michaela Moran waking up at 5 in the morning to cook burritos, through the volunteers in Tulsa standing their ground as officers called for backup, through the woman in Kansas City who watched officials pour bleach on her chili and came back the next weekend with more. The law is starting to catch up. Courts are beginning to recognize what Arnold Abbott knew all along. Feeding hungry people is not a crime, it is a right. And if the cities that tried to shut it down had spent half the energy on solving homelessness as they did on punishing the people trying to help, we might not need volunteers out there at all. If this story moved you, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And if you know someone who volunteers or works with homeless communities, share this video with them. They deserve to know they are not alone in this fight.